This voyage of discovery starts with a gin and tonic. In the warmer weather, when I sit out in my favourite gin and tonic seat in our garden, I'm facing the back of Eleanor Cottage, and it looks like this. It has always puzzled me how a relatively small cottage came to be clad in dressed limestone, an expensive building material generally associated with high-status buildings and not small cottages. Walking along the high street, I noticed the garden walls had been built using dressed limestone, and it had also been used to add a fascia to the rubble stone foundation of a timber frame cottage. But where had this stone come from? I recalled that a very large manor house had once stood in the middle of the village, and that this had been pulled down in 1779 and a farmhouse built in its place. Historians talked about it. The farmhouse is Manor Farm, opposite the Pilgrim. I thought I ought to visit it to see if there was any evidence of the old manor house, and if it had been built of dressed stone. But before heading off to Manor Farm, let's look at dressed stone and its significance. The limestone we find used in buildings all around us is Portland stone. It is easily identified by all the fossilised shells and sea creatures you see in it. Our parish church, as well as Ovings and Quaintons, is built of it. It appears in outcrops at Oving, Pitchcott and on Quainton Hill, so a ready supply was on tap over the centuries. Since the quarries were up on hills, carting the stuff down into the villages was made easier and therefore cheaper. There's a big difference between a wall made of limestone rubble, which is assembled like a mosaic from stones of varying sizes, and a wall made of dressed limestone laid in courses like bricks. Dressed stone requires a mason to work a rough block to create 4 flat faces, with each block of a predetermined and matching height and depth, so that level courses can be laid. This is time-consuming and expensive, which is why it is unusual to see dressed stone being used to create garden walls. So let's go to Manor Farmhouse to see what that tells us, and an obvious place to start is in the cellars. It is immediately clear that these were the cellars of the original manor house, because there are blind doorways leading to what would have been other spaces. There is the back of a hearth, meaning there was once a fireplace the other side, in a room that no longer exists. Everywhere is limestone, even this corbel stone, a bracket holding up the timber floor above. This corbel and the shape of the blocked Gothic arched doorways tell us this was an early 16th century construction. Here is a late 15th century limestone corbel in the Lady Chapel in our church here in North Marston. And that ties in with the historical records that talk of a 16th century mansion with additional 17th century bays. We don't know what it looked like, but contemporary examples suggest it might have looked something like these. But who built it and when? We must remember that a manor is a large estate, and only some had manorial properties built on them. Lords of manors often had several manors scattered around, and only lived in one of them, the manorial seat, usually meaning that family members or tenants lived in the other manors. The lords of these manors relied on a steady income from rent from people living on the estate, sometimes a whole village. The more land, the more rent. Manors were acquired through marriage or bequest, and some of the land-owning families amassed a huge number of estates and tremendous wealth. This applies to one of the early owners of the manor at Marston, a man called Oliver Vachel, who inherited the manor in 1537. Here's his coat of arms. He was an MP for a Wiltshire constituency. We don't know if there was a manor house on the site when he inherited it, or whether he commissioned its construction. The Vachels were an immensely wealthy family with manorial estates all over the home counties. This is a picture of one of the family estates at Reading. When this man came to North Marston in 1511 and again in 1521, it is possible he will have seen and maybe stayed at the manor house in the village. When a decade later Henry undertook the dissolution of the monasteries, the man appointed to oversee the disposal of monastic land in Buckinghamshire and Bedfordshire was based in North Marston. Again, given the prestige attached to this function, it is not unreasonable to assume Henry's land agent stayed at Marston Manor House. Vachel died in 1564 and the manor passed to his son Stephen. In 1573, the manor and its manor house were sold to a Richard Saunders, another hugely wealthy owner of numerous estates who hailed from Amersham. Here's his coat of arms. It seems Saunders actually lived in the manor house because when he died in 1602, he was buried at North Marston Church, implying that North Marston was his manorial seat. During the Saunders family tenure, the manor house was extended. Generations of Saunders retained the manor and manor house until it was inherited through marriage by Francis Wasty, the MP for Oxford, whose family held the manor of Church Cowley in Oxfordshire. In 1779, Wasty demolished the manor house and built a farmhouse. The year of the demolition, a year after North Marston was enclosed, is surely no coincidence. It is likely that despite receiving an allotment of 95 acres adjacent to the manor house, as compensation for the loss of other land elsewhere in the parish, Wasty reckoned the estate was not as viable as it had been prior to enclosure. We know from later accounts that the farmhouse, as it stands today, was built on part of the manor house's servants' quarters and incorporated the manor house stables. Aerial pictures of the farmhouse allow us to see the extent of the footprint of the original manor house, which was described by some historians as a mansion. This shows Manor Farm in 1959, and being a winter picture means certain ground features show up quite well. I have traced the line of the walls of the manor house, evident from lines of dressed limestone still in place. The wall to the south side of the garden is relatively modern, and there is some evidence the manor house extended to encompass the site of the large tree in the field to the south of the existing boundary. Linear patches of nettles that grow up to and around the tree suggest a masonry structure was here, probably a south wing. Here is another aerial picture taken more recently. I have marked the huge footprint of the manor house. Now let's get back on the ground and have a closer look at those old walls. We'll start with the boundary wall on the north side, which once would have abutted the village green. Here's a picture of it from the road, taken many years ago. The coping stones on the top are to protect the wall from weather damage. A closer look reveals a very well built wall with evidence of much larger stones at its foot. This suggests that whilst it is now a garden wall, it once formed the north flank of the original manor house. If we now go to the east side, the evidence of the original manor house wall is equally as strong, with very large dressed stones forming the base of the wall, running the entire width of the garden from the north wall up to the modern brick wall on the south side. These pictures are taken looking across towards the tree I mentioned earlier on the south side of the existing brick wall. They suggest the construction of a south-facing wing. If you pace out the perimeter walls of the manor house, it reveals a building as big as this. Can these dressed stone remnants tell us anything more? If we measure the stones used in the facing on the back of the farmhouse and at the stones used to build the north and east walls, we can see a pattern emerging of standard sizes. This could be helpful in trying to work out if these same stones might have found their way elsewhere when the manor house was demolished in 1779. Wasty would have commissioned a local agent to dispose of the huge quantity of reusable dressed stone. So do any of these sightings around the village suggest the stones have been recycled from the old manor house, although some of the stone was used to augment the brickwork on the rear of the farmhouse. Starting at the garden wall at Marston House, we soon find virtually the entire wall is built from courses of type B dressed stones. If we pop down to Eleanor Cottage, here we find the most common stones used are type A, the smaller type. Crossing the road to 3 High Street, the stones used to conceal the rubble foundations and dress the bottom half of the ground floor wall are also type A. Walking back up the High Street, we notice that Michaelmas Cottage used a lot of limestone in its construction, although not all in courses of dressed limestone. It appears the story of this limestone is that it came from the manor's medieval stone barn that was demolished to create the more modern structure that stands on the site today. Clearly, the barn was mainly constructed of rubble and not dressed stone, as an agricultural storage building would not have warranted the expense of dressed stone. If we walk up Church Street, we find another dressed stone garden wall, this being built of type A dressed stone. Along Shawn Lane, we are met by the Wesley Centre, formerly the Wesleyan Methodist Church. The original building, which was sited on an old malt house, was opened in 1833. It made extensive use of dressed stone, and again this is nearly all type A. Far from being missing, Marston's mansion is all around us, from the walls of buildings and even edging flower borders, like here at the pottery, which is only a short stride back to Eleanor Cottage and my back garden. And another gin and tonic.